What I would like to do is talk about, yes, mountains, but the role of knowledge and science in bringing different mountain communities and countries together. So the first off is ICIMOD, International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, works in 8 different mountain countries in the region. So that's, yes, it's in the Himalayas, but also the Hindu Kush Mountains in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Karakoram Range in Pakistan, the Tibetan Plateau, and the associated hills is this broad area we work, and I believe also the area of the Himalayan Consensus. So this extends about 3,500 kilometers from Afghanistan to Myanmar. Also, of course, including Nepal, Bhutan, India, China, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. In those mountains and hills, there are about 200 million people. But incredibly, and we were talking about languages, there are about 1,000 living languages in the area. And it's really that diversity that's going to hold the key as we're moving ahead to the future. This is the home to 10 major river basins, and about 1.3 billion people live in these river basins. That's like the Indus, Ganges, the Yellow Yangtze River, and more. And if we count on the food and energy produced, probably about 3 to 4 billion people rely on those water resources as well. And of course, the carbon stocks are important. The biodiversity and ecosystems are hugely important in the area, and people are definitely looking for the energy resources in the mountains. So it's definitely these, what we call Hindu Kush Himalayas are definitely a regional and global asset. Now, what we feel is that that's a shared asset between the countries. And we feel on the one hand that if we can jointly manage the resources between countries, that potentially can lead to benefits for all. But it's that joint management that really will play the key as we're moving to the future. On one hand, that management of mountain resources could feel like a dream. So in some indices, we have 5 of the 8 countries as least developed countries. 5 of the 8 are on the alert status as fragile states, and about 4 of the 8 are very low or low ratings as far as the peace index. So we have to jump a long way forward. But I do believe that if we focus on the mountains, if we focus on knowledge, if we focus on the connections between it, we can make a lot of progress as far as cooperation for the benefit of mountain people and beyond. And that's what I'd like to explore in the talk, how we use science and knowledge to make that collaboration happening. My organization, ICIMOD, has been there for about 30 plus years. And really some visionary founders said, hey, let's get together over mountains. But I can say the first years of those 30 were quite difficult, with countries just arguing for their own resources, for their own attention. But that has changed quite recently, where we find the countries looking for ICIMOD as a place where they can collaborate around knowledge and cooperation. In some of the areas of common interests, people have different kinds of problems that they share, say about floods, droughts, about climate change, about migration. And they also recognize that a lot of the resources cross borders, like the water resources or biodiversity in the region, and air pollution as well. So I think a turning point was in 2007 with the IPCC report number 4. And in that report, they said something like all the glaciers will disappear by 2030 and we'll have rivers that are ephemeral rivers. Of course, that's not true at all. But what happened at that time is it brought a lot of regional, local, and global attention into the mountains and what's happening to climate change. People were saying, hey, let's see if we can work together to get more information. But now, say at ICIMOD, we have good experience at science and knowledge collaboration very much across borders on issues like floods, like biodiversity, and also on air pollution. A story on the floods is something like this. If you want to cooperate on water, it's very, very difficult across borders. People don't like to give, say, flow data, the basic data. But I remember talking to a Chinese official saying, well, geez, if we could get some information about the floods coming from China into Nepal, eventually into India, that would make a huge difference. He said, we just can't share the data. But what he did say is, yes, we can share the warning sign. we can share the warning with you. And kind of steps like that are very big, very important steps toward collaboration as we're looking to the future. We also find that we've had a lot of success on collaboration around knowledge and science itself. I did want to talk a little bit about climate change in mountain areas here. What we have found, and by the way, we have made a lot of steps since 2007 to fill in some of the knowledge gaps. And what we find is something called temperature amplification in mountains. And what that means is it gets hotter faster at higher elevations. So if in Paris people were saying, let's hold the temperature to 1.5 or 2 degrees, that could mean 3 or 4 degrees in mountain areas. And so mountains are highly, highly vulnerable to climate change. What we see a lot is glacier and snowmelt, and probably Mats Eriksson talked a lot about that, resulting in changing hydrology. What I worry about most, what we don't know much about, are changing rainfall patterns, changing monsoon patterns. But there are indications that there will be more really intense rainfall events, more floods and droughts as we're moving into the future. So the consequence of climate change moving forward will be changing ecosystems, changing farming systems, changing in the hydrology, the water supply in our world. What was interesting, perhaps in the big rivers like the Indus and Ganges, the annual water supply may not change so much because there might be more rain in the future. But certainly in high mountain areas, communities directly dependent on glaciers will definitely feel an impact. What I'm most frightened about in the future are the occurrences of more floods and more droughts as we are looking ahead. But we also recognize in this area, it's not just climate change. There are so many other changes happening in the region. So we like to use the term climate plus change. So other changes like outmigration, especially of men, like globalization, migration, urbanization, all of this happening at the same time, and it's hard even to intermingle where climate change and these other changes fit into the story. Plus, I know there's been a lot of discussion about food, energy, and water in the discussions here. Certainly major challenges in mountain areas. But I think the key is to see this as these are not necessarily all negative, right? And there are certainly lots and lots of opportunities, and that came up in the last session as well. And just for an example, there's so much male outmigration that what we see in rural mountain communities, the women are becoming much stronger at managing their resources and kind of breaking down traditional roles. And so we do see a lot of scope of women empowerment, and it's moving in a very good trend, I think. In mountain areas, it used to be the traditional grain crops, but people are growing a lot more high-valued crops, which I think there's a good business opportunity for high-valued crops, medicinal herbs, to find their way to the market, making sure that mountain communities get equitable benefits from these. Ecotourism is big, clean energy, a lot of opportunities, but also just looking at that upstream and downstream linkages. If people downstream are reaping the benefits, can we have the institutions to send some of those benefits back to mountain people? And certainly the role of a vibrant business community can help us to realize a lot of those benefits as we're moving forward. So I think a lot has happened on this front in the last years. And we're happy at ICIMOD to provide a role as a platform where we do get people from the region talking about these issues and how to move forward in policy and practice as well. Now, I want to mention a few areas where I can see us moving forward together with Himalayan Consensus. One is what we have thought is if this is an area of knowledge gap and we have key policy questions like how do we provide energy for everybody? How do we get out of poverty? How do we adapt to climate change? What is happening with climate change? What we thought it would be great if we could have something like an IPCC but for the mountains. And so we have started a process, and we call that the Himalayan Monitoring and Assessment Program. And so the idea is to bring experts, knowledgeable people, also policymakers together, and to see if we can put the best knowledge behind this kind of policy discussion. So the reason for this HIMAP assessment actually serves a few different purposes. One is to get knowledge together about mountains, but the second purpose is to get people together. So we have like 150 people working across these 8 countries and beyond, really focusing about mountains. And the third purpose is really to engage policymakers, engage other stakeholders with this science. Now, an important part of the work that I find quite fascinating is the scenarios, right? So if you're you're looking at the trends, say, of increased climate change, increased migration, environmental degradation, the idea is not necessarily to say that's what's going to happen in the future. The idea is to envision a future where you see something different, where you can picture yourself riding easily on an electric train from Kabul to Delhi to Islamabad to Kathmandu and clear to Myanmar, right? Something where we're all working together, powered by renewable energy, where we could all appreciate the diversity. So the question is, how do you get to that future? So what we do is we kind of backtrack and say what steps need to be taken to get to that future. And actually that would be an interesting discussion to have with everybody here. But in that discussion, we've had people identify 3 different challenges. One is disasters. We have to face disasters in the future much better than we have now. And the second is climate change in itself. But the third big challenge is the weak governance we see in the region, spanning local, national, and regional governance to get there. But so some of the steps, and I hope to hear we're in the process, but that we do need big and small investments as we're moving forward. We do have to figure out how to adapt to these changes a lot better, but we need key policy and governance arrangements, both at very local level to regional level. What I want to do finally is to say that this work is very much inspired by what we see in the Arctic. It was interesting, I was at a meeting above the Arctic Circle, and there's a thing called the Arctic Council. And they have 8 countries, like the Himalayas have 8 countries. You know, this so it used to be Soviet Union, United States, really contending several issues. But now they also have an Arctic Council. And so the question is, could we envision something like a Himalayan Council in the future? I think we've got a lot of steps to get there, but perhaps these initial steps are quite important. But what was interesting, to start the Arctic Council, there was actually a science process, and that science process was the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. So that's also why we're thinking this Himalayan Monitoring and Assessment Program is one way we can discuss science across borders, get scientists working together. We have a lot of steps working together to actually get that kind of regional cooperation that we need to get these resources managed together. So what we proposed recently in the Arctic was some kind of Arctic-Himalaya alliance, right, where we could share experience and get together, also talk on the global stage about climate change, for example. But then we thought it would be really good to have some kind of process, something called a science policy dialogue for the Himalayan region. And so what I would propose to the Himalayan Consensus is perhaps we can do that with you all, right? And is that we can have that kind of science policy business discussion together as we're moving forward in this kind of event. So what we do see is a lot of scope for collaboration with knowledge institutes, with science institutes, with business communities as well when we're moving forward. So we're hoping actually that we can indeed join forces with the Himalayan Consensus. So I do feel personally that these steps of making bridges, right, of creating the connections across countries between, in our case, science, are very, very important for us moving forward in this area for the benefit of the mountains, the Himalayan Consensus, the benefit for all of us. Thank you very much.